Before people feared these prophecies, they were something else entirely. They were not always treated as clear warnings about the end of the world. They were not always read as secret maps of the future. In many cases, they began as fragments of belief, sacred imagery, poetic visions, political messages, or attempts to make sense of a world that already felt unstable. That is what makes ancient prophecy so fascinating. Its power did not come only from what was written. It came from the conditions in which it was written, and from the generations that later returned to those words looking for answers. When we hear the phrase ancient prophecy, it is easy to imagine a mysterious figure predicting catastrophe in perfect detail, as though history had been revealed in advance. But the reality was often far more complex, and in many ways far more unsettling. Ancient prophecy was usually born in moments of pressure. It appeared in cultures facing war, conquest, exile, plague, political collapse, religious crisis, or social fear. It emerged when people felt surrounded by forces they could not control. Empires rose, cities burned, kingdoms fell, borders shifted, old certainties collapsed. And in the middle of that uncertainty, people searched for meaning. Not only meaning in what had happened, but meaning in what was still happening to them. That is where prophecy begins to change. Because for the people who first encountered many of these texts, the question was not always, how will the world end? Often, the question was far more immediate. Why is this happening to us? What does this suffering mean? Has our world fallen into chaos, or is there still some hidden order behind it? In that sense, ancient prophetic writing was not always about prediction in the way modern audiences imagine it. It was often a language of interpretation, a way of turning fear into pattern, a way of looking at war, tyranny, famine, corruption, or disaster, and refusing to believe that history was only random. That refusal matters, because human beings have always struggled with uncertainty. We can endure hardship more easily than meaninglessness. We can face danger more easily than silence. And so, when the world becomes unstable, people begin looking for signs. They look backward, they search old texts, they revisit forgotten symbols, they ask whether earlier generations left behind warnings that were never fully understood. And once that begins, a text can become something more powerful than it originally was. A vision becomes a forecast, a symbol becomes a code, a poetic image becomes evidence. What may once have spoken to one crisis begins to feel as though it speaks to every crisis. That is how certain ancient prophecies survive. Not because they were always simple, not because they were always literal, but because they were flexible enough to be read again and again by people living through new fear. A beast described in one age could become a tyrant in another. A falling kingdom could be reimagined as the collapse of an entirely different empire. A warning written for one wounded community could later be read as a message to all humanity. Over time, prophecy stopped belonging only to the world that produced it. It became portable, it traveled across centuries, and each generation added something to it. A new anxiety, a new interpretation, a new reason to believe that the old words were somehow speaking directly to them. This is why ancient prophecies often feel darker now than they may have at the moment of their creation, because they carry layers. They carry the fear of the first people who wrote them, then the fear of those who preserved them, then the fear of those who reinterpreted them during later collapse, later war, later plague, later unrest. They gather dread over time, and eventually, what remains is no longer just a text. It becomes a cultural warning, a shadow passed from century to century, a symbolic archive of human anxiety, a record not only of what people believed, but of what they feared most when the future began to feel unstable. That is why these ancient warnings continue to return. They are revived when society feels fragile. They are rediscovered when institutions weaken. They are quoted when violence spreads, when leaders fail, when disease moves across borders, when economies shake, and when ordinary people begin to feel that the world they know is becoming harder to recognize. In those moments, ancient prophecy offers something dangerously powerful. It offers structure. It suggests that chaos may not be chaos at all, that behind confusion, there may be sequence. Behind collapse, there may be design. Behind fear, there may be a script that was written long before we arrive. Whether true or not, that possibility is difficult for people to resist, because the idea that someone saw it coming can feel strangely comforting, even when what they saw was terrifying. And maybe that is where the real darkness begins, not in the original words themselves, but in the human need to return to them, the need to believe that the present was anticipated, the need to believe that disaster follows a pattern, the need to believe that history leaves clues before it breaks. So before these texts became feared as prophecies of the end, they were something more immediate, more human, and perhaps more revealing. They were responses to uncertainty, attempts to interpret suffering, ways of preserving meaning when the world no longer felt stable. But their true power began much later. It began when people stopped seeing them only as reflections of the past and started seeing them as warnings about the future. The moment ancient symbols were read as warnings about the future, everything changed. What had once been visions tied to crisis, persecution, and survival began to feel like something far more dangerous. Not reflections of one wounded age, but messages for every age that came after it. And no texts shaped that fear more deeply than the apocalyptic visions of the Bible. Because this is where ancient prophecy stopped feeling distant. This is where it began to take on images people could never forget. Beasts rising from chaos, kingdoms collapsing in sequence, seals being broken, horsemen crossing the earth, a final enemy, a final judgment, and beyond all of it, the terrifying suggestion that history itself was moving toward an appointed confrontation. One of the most influential of these visions appears in the book of Daniel. In its apocalyptic section, Daniel describes 4 terrible beasts rising from the sea, each representing a succession of earthly powers. In the historical reading, most often given by scholars, this vision reflects the pressures of the Hellenistic age and culminates in the tyranny associated with Antiochus IV Epiphanes, before divine judgment falls and lasting dominion is given to one like a son of man. But what matters here is not only the original context, it is the imagery, because the beast is one of the most enduring symbols in all prophetic literature. It does something simple and unforgettable. It transforms empire into monster. That is why it lasts. A kingdom can be argued about. A ruler can be defended. An empire can call itself civilized. But once power becomes a beast, it no longer feels political. It feels unnatural, predatory, hungry. And once later, generations learn to read that symbol beyond its original setting, the vision became limitless. A beast could be Rome, then something else, then someone else, then any force large enough, violent enough, or frightening enough to make people believe history had turned against them. That is how a symbol escapes its century. And then there is revelation. If Daniel gave the world a grammar of apocalyptic fear, Revelation turned it into spectacle. Written in the late 1st century, and addressed to 7 churches in Asia. Revelation presents the present age as a time of tribulation, endurance, false power, and coming vindication. Its symbols are deliberately strange: beasts, dragons, seals, trumpets, cosmic signs, martyrs, catastrophe, and final judgment. The text was meant not only to warn, but to steady believers under pressure by promising that evil power would not have the last word. But symbols do not remain controlled for long, especially symbols this powerful. The horsemen are the clearest example. In Revelation, the opening of the first 4 seals unleashes 4 riders: a conqueror on a white horse, war on a red horse, famine on a black horse, and death on a pale horse. Whether interpreted historically, theologically, or symbolically, the power of the image comes from its sequence. It does not show one disaster, it shows escalation. And that sequence is exactly why it haunted so many centuries. Conquest, violence, scarcity, death. It feels less like an isolated vision and more like a pattern. A pattern civilizations recognize almost instinctively. When societies fracture, when war spreads, when prices rise, when disease appears, when institutions weaken, those horsemen do not remain bland. They begin to feel current, not because the text changes, but because human fear keeps finding itself inside the order of the symbols. That is the real genius of biblical apocalyptic imagery. It is vivid enough to be unforgettable, but open enough to be reapplied. The same is true of the beast in Revelation. The text speaks of monstrous powers, false prophecy, deception, coercion, and the famous number of the beast. Many scholars have read the 666 image as a coded reference to Nero, while later centuries expanded the symbol far beyond that possible historical target. Over time, the beast became less a single figure than a permanent template for feared authority. And once that happened, biblical prophecy stopped being merely scriptural. It became cultural. Painters used it, preachers used it, kings feared it, reformers weaponized it, mystics expanded it. Ordinary people living through plague, invasion, famine, or social collapse reached for it because it seemed to offer a hidden structure beneath visible disaster. This is why these visions shaped fear for so long. They did not merely describe the end. They gave disaster a face. Not just suffering, but horsemen. Not just tyranny, but beasts. Not just corruption, but false prophets. Not just death, but judgment. And judgment changes everything. Because once catastrophe is tied to judgment, history no longer feels accidental. It begins to feel moral. War is no longer just war. It may be a sign. Collapse is no longer just collapse. It may be a sequence. Power is no longer just power. It may be the final kingdom before the fall. That is why these visions stayed alive when so many other ancient writings faded into obscurity. They were too emotionally efficient to disappear. They condensed chaos into images the mind could carry. And once those images entered cultural memory, they never really left. Even people who have never read Daniel and never opened Revelation still recognize the shadow of what those texts created. The horseman, the beast, the marked world, the final battle between corruption and judgment. These are no longer just religious symbols. They are part of the architecture of fear itself. And maybe that is what made them so durable. Not simply their age, not simply their authority, but the fact that they gave generations a way to imagine collapse before it arrived, a language for dread, a set of images vast enough to absorb each new crisis, a symbolic system that could survive the death of empires and still feel strangely awake in the modern mind. That is why the biblical visions mattered so much. They did not just describe terror, they taught later ages how to see terror. And once those images entered the imagination of the world, they could never be fully contained again. But the Bible was not the only source of warnings that survived. Some warnings survived not because they were clear, but because people needed them in moments of fear. Not every ancient prophecy came in the form of a sacred book. Some arrived as a voice in a temple, some as a name attached to a vanished manuscript, some as fragments copied and recopied through centuries until no one could say with certainty where the warning had truly begun, and that uncertainty gave them power. Long before later generations imagined prophecy as a fixed set of end-time predictions, the ancient world already had places, figures, and traditions that claimed access to something hidden, not always the future in exact detail, but patterns, omens, divine intention, and glimpses of what lay beyond ordinary knowledge. In Greece, the most famous of these was Delphi. There, the oracle of Apollo spoke through the Pythia, and for centuries, rulers, lawmakers, colonists, and petitioners sought divine guidance from that sanctuary. Delphi became powerful, not because every answer was simple, but because it carried the authority of place, ritual, and distance. What came from there felt as though it came from beyond ordinary human judgment. That detail matters, because mystery and authority have always strengthened each other. The harder a message is to fully possess, the more weight people tend to give it. The more remote its source, the less ordinary it feels. And in periods of instability, that distance can make a warning seem almost untouchable. But Delphi was only one part of a much larger world of prophetic imagination. There was also the Sibyl. In Greek legend and literature, the Sibyl was an ancient prophetic woman associated with ecstatic utterance and extreme age, a figure already wrapped in distance and myth. Her words were imagined not as casual advice, but as pronouncements carried forward from a deeper and older world. And from that figure emerged one of the most haunting prophetic traditions in the ancient Mediterranean. According to Roman tradition, the Sibylline books were brought from Cumae and became some of the most authoritative religious texts in Rome. They were written in Greek, and they were consulted especially in moments of crisis or doubt, not as everyday literature, but as guarded resources for interpreting danger. That alone is enough to explain part of their enduring fascination. A people under threat does not only want information, it wants sanction. It wants confirmation that its fear has meaning. And a text consulted only when the world begins to shake will always feel different from a text read in ordinary peace. That is how warnings deepen, not only through content, but through circumstance. A manuscript brought out during plague, unrest, military defeat, or public uncertainty acquires a special atmosphere. It begins to feel less like writing and more like an emergency key, something opened only when normal explanations no longer seem enough. Later, this atmosphere grew even stranger through the Sibylline oracles. Despite the similar name, these were not the same as the old Roman Sibylline books. The Sibylline oracles were a later collection of prophecies written by Jewish and Christian authors from around 150 BCE to 180 CE. They were attributed to a legendary Sibyl to cloak newer ideas in ancient authority. And that tells us something important about prophecy. People trust old voices, or at least they want to. A warning feels heavier when it appears to come from deep antiquity. A prediction feels more dangerous when it sounds inherited rather than invented. And so across the ancient world, later writers learned that one of the most effective ways to make a message powerful was to make it appear older than it was. This was not unique to the Sibylline material. In apocalyptic literature more broadly, authors often wrote under revered ancient names and used esoteric language, symbolic imagery, and hidden knowledge. That is where the atmosphere of forgotten warnings truly begins, not simply in the age of the text, but in the feeling that the text was sealed away, half understood, rediscovered too late, or preserved through fragments. Even when the words were ambiguous, their ambiguity became an advantage, because a vague warning can survive longer than a precise one. A coded passage can be reopened by every era. A cryptic oracle can be made to fit a new empire, a new ruler, a new disaster, a new fear. And once that happens, prophecy becomes less about one original message and more about a chain of inheritance. A priest preserves it, a scribe copies it, a chronicler reframes it, a frightened generation revives it, and suddenly, the warning no longer belongs to the world that created it. It belongs to every later age willing to read itself into the shadows. That is why these older oracle traditions matter so much in the history of fear. They created the archive before the apocalypse, the feeling that somewhere in the past there existed guarded words, hidden pronouncements, half-lost manuscripts, and sacred voices that had already spoken about crisis before crisis arrived. Not always clearly, not always honestly, not always in the form later generations imagined, but clearly enough to survive. And once survival itself becomes proof of importance, the warning grows stronger with time. What was once a consultation becomes a legend. What was once a fragment becomes a prophecy. What was once a local tradition becomes a permanent part of cultural memory. By then, it no longer matters whether the original message was narrow or specific. What matters is that it feels old, preserved, and unfinished. And unfinished warnings are the ones people fear most because they leave room for the future to enter them. And outside the Mediterranean world, other civilizations imagined the end in ways that were just as unsettling. Not every prophecy describes the end as punishment. Some describe it as inevitability. That difference changes everything. Once we move beyond the biblical world, we find other visions of collapse. They are no less frightening, but they do not always speak in the same moral language. Some do not describe the end as a verdict. They describe it as a stage, a turning point, a final convulsion built into the structure of existence itself. And that may be even more unsettling. If destruction is not simply a punishment for human failure, then it is not something that can always be avoided. It becomes part of the design. One powerful example is found in Norse mythology. Ragnarok is not merely a disaster. It is a sequence of catastrophes that culminates in the destruction of gods and men. Monstrous forces break loose and order collapses. Even the divine powers are not spared. Yet in some versions, the earth rises again and human life begins anew. That structure is important. Ragnarok is terrifying not only for what it destroys, but for what it reveals. The gods themselves are mortal within the story. Even divine power is not absolute. Even the guardians of order move toward an appointed end. This is not a warning that says change or disaster may come. It is a vision that says disaster is already woven into the fate of the world. That is why Ragnarok has remained so haunting. It imagines collapse on a cosmic scale, not just the fall of a city or a king or a single civilization, but the breaking of order itself. The old boundaries fail. Monsters return. Fire and battle consume what once seemed permanent. The world that held meaning is torn apart. And yet, the story does not end with pure nothingness. After devastation, there is renewal. After the fall, there is return. What is destroyed is not merely erased, it is replaced. That combination gives Ragnarok a strange emotional duality. It is both apocalyptic and cyclical. It offers terror, but not only terror. It imagines ruin as part of a larger pattern that continues beyond catastrophe. A different but equally powerful vision appears in the idea of Kali Yuga. In Hindu cosmology, time unfolds through 4 great ages, and Kali Yuga is the 4th and final age. Kali Yuga is understood as the most degenerate and troubled era. It is associated with conflict disorder, moral decline, and the weakening of what once held society together. At its close, destruction gives way to renewal as the cycle begins again. This is not the same kind of end found in many apocalyptic traditions of the West. It is not simply history moving toward one final terminal event. It is history moving through decline, a slow darkening, a long corrosion, the sense that the world is not suddenly ending, but gradually losing its alignment, its balance, its truth. That is why Kali Yuga remains so emotionally powerful even now, because it does not depend on one dramatic sign alone. It depends on atmosphere. It speaks to a feeling many people recognize almost immediately, that something essential in the world is weakening, that disorder is no longer temporary, that corruption is no longer exceptional, that we may already be living deep inside the age of decline. That is a different kind of fear from Ragnarok, but it touches the same nerve. Ragnarok fears the violent collapse of order. Kali Yuga fears the erosion of order. One arrives like a final storm. The other unfolds like a long decay, but both confront the same human terror, that the structures holding reality together are less stable than they appear. This is where ancient end-time traditions become especially fascinating, because they do not all imagine the end in the same form, yet they circle the same emotional truth. Something fails, something sacred weakens. The world as we know it becomes unsustainable, and what follows is either destruction or transformation. In that sense, the real link between these traditions is not doctrine, it is structure. They are stories about order under pressure, about the moment when the visible world no longer feels secure, about the suspicion that beneath ordinary life, larger cycles are moving, whether moral, cosmic, divine, or mythic, and that human beings are powerless to stop them once they begin. That is why these traditions still resonate. Not because modern people remember every detail, most do not, but because the underlying fear is timeless. The fear that history is not stable, the fear that civilization can decay from within, the fear that what feels permanent may only be temporary, the fear that endings are not accidents, but inevitabilities waiting for their season. And perhaps that is what makes these myths more than mythology. They become frameworks for interpreting instability. In one age, they are sacred cosmology. In another, they become metaphors. In another, they are revived as warnings. And in every age of uncertainty, people begin to wonder the same thing. Are we watching collapse from the outside, or are we already living inside it? That question is what gives these traditions their afterlife. Because once an ancient vision can be read, not as a dead belief, but as a living pattern, it stops belonging to the past. It enters the present. And that idea becomes even more powerful when people begin to believe that they themselves are living in the age of the warning. Every generation has looked at old warnings and wondered if the prophecy was really about them. That instinct is older than any one religion, older than any one civilization, and older than any one test. When the world becomes unstood, people do not only look for safety, they look for meaning, and meaning becomes most urgent when ordinary explanations no longer feel strong enough. That is why ancient prophecies return most powerfully in times of war, disease, unrest, and social breakdown. Apocalyptic thinking has long flourished in moments of crisis, offering people a way to read chaos as part of a larger pattern rather than as random collapse. In the Christian world especially, periods of upheaval have repeatedly produced renewed millennial and end-time expectation. Because crisis changes the way old words are heard. A text that felt symbolic in one century can sound immediate in another. A vision once tied to a persecuted community can begin to look like a forecast for an entire civilization. A beast, a horseman, a dark age, a final kingdom. These images remain dormant until history gives people a reason to awaken them again. And history always does. When plague spreads, the old symbols of judgment return. When empires strain, people begin to speak again of collapsing kingdoms. When violence becomes global, horsemen feel less like metaphor and more like memory. When corruption deepens and institutions weaken, even cyclical ideas like Kali Yuga begin to sound less like distant cosmology and more like a description of the present age. This is the real mechanism behind fear. People do not simply inherit prophecy, they reactivate it. They take the pressures of their own time, war, famine, disease, distrust, instability, technological anxiety, moral confusion, and they project them backward onto ancient texts. Then those texts appear to speak with fresh precision, as though they had been waiting for this exact moment all along. But often what feels like prediction is actually recognition. Human beings are pattern-seeking. We connect fragments. We compare present fear with inherited symbols. We search older language for confirmation that our crisis is not ordinary, that it belongs to something larger, something fated, something already seen. And once enough people begin doing that at the same time, prophecy becomes social. It spreads through sermons, books, rumor, television, forums, videos, and headlines. It becomes less a private interpretation and more a shared atmosphere. The old warning is no longer sitting quietly in a manuscript. It is moving through culture again. That is what happened with 2012. For years, the date December 21st, 2012 was treated across popular culture as a possible end-of-the-world event, allegedly rooted in the ancient Maya calendar. But Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian explains that much of the public narrative was built on misconceptions, astronomical misinformation, and speculation pushed largely by non-experts, not by Maya communities themselves. The completion of the 13 Baktun cycle in the long count calendar marked the end of one cycle, not a confirmed Maya prophecy of global annihilation. And that is exactly why 2012 matters in this story. Because it reveals how modern prophecy panic worked. Take an ancient system, remove it from its original world, surround it with mystery, add crisis, media repetition, and public anxiety. And soon a calendar becomes a warning, a cycle becomes an ending, and uncertainty becomes spectacle. In other words, the fear was modern, even when the material was ancient. That pattern is not unique to 2012. It happens whenever people begin to feel that history is accelerating beyond their control. Whenever events start to look too large, too chaotic, too interconnected, too morally charged, ancient prophecy becomes newly attractive. It offers the one thing fear always wants most: structure. Not comfort, exactly. Structure. The suggestion that events follow sequence, that collapse has meaning, that suffering belongs to a design, that what feels unprecedented may already have been anticipated by voices from another age. And there is something strangely seductive in that. Because pure chaos is difficult to endure. But a warning, even a terrifying warning, creates the illusion that the world is still legible, that someone left behind signs, that the present, no matter how frightening, still fits inside a pattern. Maybe that is why every generation is tempted to believe it may be the last. Not because each generation is irrational, but because every generation eventually encounters its own form of instability, and ancient prophecy offers a language grand enough to contain it. For one era, the signs are war and empire. For another, plague and famine. For another, ideological collapse. For another, ecological dread, technological acceleration, and the feeling that the future itself has become harder to trust. The deeper we go into ancient prophecy, the harder it becomes to separate warning from interpretation. That may be the most important truth in this entire story. By the time a prophecy survives for centuries, it is rarely still standing in its original form. It has been copied, translated, interpreted, expanded, argued over, feared, and reused. It has passed through the hands of priests, scribes, believers, rulers, reformers, mystics, skeptics, and storytellers. And with each generation, something changes. Sometimes the words remain, but the meaning shifts. That is why ancient prophecy is so difficult to judge with certainty. Not because it is meaningless, but because it exists at the intersection of text, memory, crisis, and belief. A vision written for one historical moment can later be read as a warning for another. A symbolic image can become a literal prediction. A local crisis can be transformed into a universal pattern. And once that process begins, it becomes almost impossible to say where the original message ends and the later imagination begins. This is especially true with apocalyptic texts. Many ancient prophecies were never written as modern people now imagine prophecy. They were not always direct forecasts with dates, names, and precise outcomes. They often used imagery, symbolism, coded language, sacred metaphor, or poetic structure. They spoke to audiences living through fear, oppression, instability, or moral confusion. That does not make them false, but it does mean they were often more layered than later generations preferred to admit. Take the great biblical visions. For some readers, beasts and kingdoms became proof of a hidden timeline of world history. For others, they were symbolic responses to political terror in the world that produced them. The same images that inspired fear also invited reinterpretation. And because those images were so powerful, they were repeatedly detached from their original setting and applied to new crises. The result is not one fixed prophecy. It is a chain of readings. The same thing happens with oracles and legendary prophetic texts. A name attached to antiquity gives authority. A damaged manuscript gives mystery. A vague warning gives flexibility. And flexibility is one of the reasons such traditions endure. A prophecy that is too precise can fail. A prophecy that is symbolic can survive almost anything. It can be reopened, reframed, rediscovered, made to fit a new empire, a new war, a new moral panic, a new age of uncertainty. That is why some warnings seem immortal, not because they predicted everything, but because they could be made to resemble many things. And then there is the problem of hindsight. Once an event has already happened, human beings become extremely skilled at looking backward and finding signs that seem obvious in retrospect. A passage that once appeared obscure can suddenly feel exact. A symbol that once seemed distant can begin to look precise. The past becomes easier to decode after history has already moved. That does not mean every connection is dishonest. But it does mean not every connection proves what people think it proves. Sometimes prophecy appears accurate because interpretation is selective. People remember the lines that seem to match and forget the lines that do not. They emphasize the similarities and soften the contradictions. They search for patterns, and once they find one, it becomes difficult to unsee it. This is not only a problem of religion or mythology, it is a problem of human psychology. We are meaning-making creatures. We connect fragments. We construct narrative. We search for sequence inside chaos. And when the world feels unstable, that instinct becomes stronger, not weaker. So what, then, can we actually say with confidence? We can say that many of these texts are real. We can say they emerged from worlds shaped by fear, pressure, and uncertainty. We can say that later generations often expanded their significance beyond their original setting. We can say that symbols such as beasts, horsemen, dark ages, final battles, and collapsing orders became culturally powerful far beyond the communities that first used them. But beyond that, certainty becomes harder. Did these prophecies literally foresee the distant future? Historians remain divided, believers remain convinced, and skeptics remain unconvinced. Were some warnings reshaped by later generations until they became something larger than they originally were? Almost certainly. Did fear itself help build the legend of prophecy? Again and again, it seems that it did. And yet, none of this makes the subject less interesting. In some ways, it makes it more interesting, because the real mystery may not be whether ancient prophecies worked like a perfect code. The real mystery may be why they continued to matter even when certainty weakened. Why did people keep returning to them? Why did old warnings survive political collapse, religious change, new science, new empires, and new centuries? Why do they still return now? Perhaps because uncertainty never disappeared. The symbols remained because the fear remained. The texts endured because the conditions that gave them power kept returning in new forms. War changed, disease changed, empires changed, technology changed, but dread did not, and so the prophecies remained available, not always as evidence, not always as proof, but as mirrors. Mirrors for civilizational anxiety, mirrors for collapse, mirrors for the suspicion that history is more fragile than it looks. So no, we cannot prove every claim attached to these prophecies. We cannot untangle every original meaning from every later interpretation. We cannot always know where sacred vision ended and legend began. But perhaps that uncertainty is part of why they still haunt us. Because a warning is sometimes most powerful when it cannot be fully resolved. And yet, even when certainty disappears, fear remains. Whether these ancient warnings were true prophecies, symbolic visions, misunderstood fragments, or stories reshaped by generations of fear, their power has clearly survived. And maybe that is the real mystery. Not whether the future was perfectly predicted, not whether every symbol can be decoded, not whether the old texts truly knew what was coming, but why humanity keeps returning to them. Why, in moments of crisis, we search old words for signs. Why we look into forgotten manuscripts, sacred visions, and half-buried myths, hoping to find proof that someone, somewhere, already understood the shape of our fear. Perhaps ancient prophecies endure because they offer something chaos never can: pattern, meaning, structure. They suggest that collapse is not random, that suffering belongs to a sequence, that even at the edge of uncertainty, history may still follow a hidden design. Whether true or not, that possibility is difficult to resist, because the deepest fear may not be that the world is ending. It may be that the world is changing in ways we cannot explain. And so we keep listening to the dead. We keep opening old books. We keep asking whether the warning was meant for us. Maybe that is why these prophecies still haunt people today. Not because the past clearly revealed the future, but because every generation is afraid that it didn't.